Get into that. I actually want to use verse 11 of that narrative here in just a moment to kind of hone in some thoughts that we might share with you today. I do want to share a couple things with you real quick before we get into the study itself. Because it wasn't really necessarily a gospel meeting, it didn't get in that list that Daryl puts out and that I share with the bulletin. But I do want to make mention of something to you. At Cedar Avenue in Moundsville this coming Saturday, I think I got that date right, this coming Saturday at 7 o'clock, Saturday evening at Cedar Avenue in Moundsville, they're going to have a sing. And I've always said that is the best building in the valley to have a sing in. And so I'm glad they're doing that. They're actually doing a singing class with their song leaders over the weekend, and then they're kind of culminating the weekend with that sing on Saturday night. So that wasn't in a bulletin or anything, but I did want to let you know that they are having that sing at 7 o'clock on this coming Saturday. And so if you're able to get up to Moundsville for that, I'm sure they would appreciate you being there. For those who may not have seen the screen, if I seem a little tired this morning, Mom had an accident last night out in the driveway and fell and suffered pretty good fractures in her face and difficulties. And we were in the ER from 9:30 till 5 this morning. And so I got home about 5:15, 5:30. The sad part for you is you would assume that if I'm tired, you're going, oh, this ought to be short. But actually, when I get tired, I tend to get long-winded. And so forgive me if that's the case this morning. I'll try not to do that and just kind of stick to the thoughts that I want to share with you. There's an interesting statement there made in verse 11 of that text when he talks about the idea that all that historical backdrop and the Old Testament accounts of that history are written for a purpose. And they're written to be an example to those whom the ends of the ages or the ends of the world are come. In other words, those of us who live in this last dispensation, if you will, and we talk about the Bible being broken up into dispensations. We talk about that patriarchal age that came where God shared His knowledge and information through the fathers, and it was passed down generation after generation. We talk then about that Mosaic age when God ushers in that Mosaic law to the Jewish people, and they are governed by that system. And then when Jesus comes, and we talk about the Christian age, and the Bible talks about that being the last of the dispensations. That once we arrive here at this Christian age, if you will, this time that Christ determined to come and to bring this new covenant with exceedingly great and precious promises, that we now reside in it. And what's interesting is Paul writes to those in Corinth and says, because we live in the last dispensation, because we have all the historical narrative that we can learn from. We've got all this great example of how God dealt with His people and how He addressed various challenges. We are the ones with no excuse. There's no reason for us not to draw the right conclusions. There's no reason for us not to make the right choices as it relates to serving and honoring God and His Son, because we've got all the information we need. We have the message that Jesus provided through His inspired writers, and we also have all of that historical documentation of what happened in those Old Testament times. And He said these things are written as an example to those who would live in this last age among men. So what does that mean? Well, let's do a quick brief history lesson, and I'm not going to read all of these narratives, particularly here in a moment especially I won't, but go back into your Old Testament for a moment, and let's just look at a couple of texts and kind of set the stage for what we're trying to learn from this idea that Paul expresses there in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. Verse 17 of Exodus chapter 40, notice that it came to pass in the first month of the second year, on the first day of the month, that the tabernacle was raised up. And so you remember the first kind of place that they used as a center for worship was a tabernacle. And if you recall, that was structured while they're in the 40 years of wandering because it needed to be movable. They weren't staying in one location. And so they needed a tabernacle, a place to continue to worship God that could move along with them when they wandered through the wilderness. So it did find itself stationary for periods of time. Ultimately, that would set the way for the temple to arrive, where there was that permanent place that they would worship and honor God. In Numbers chapter 1, in the first two verses, we find that just a short time later, after erecting the tabernacle, that they then begin to number the people. It's time for them to know exactly how big are these tribes, who they are, how many people are residing within each of the various tribes that had come out of Egypt and towards that promised land. And you see that in verse 1 of Numbers chapter 1, where he says, "Now the Lord spoke to Moses in the wilderness of Sinai, in the tabernacle of meeting, on the first day of the second month in the second year, after they had come out of the land of Egypt, saying, Take a census of all the congregation of the children of Israel by their families and by their fathers' houses, according to the number of names, every male individually." And so you see this process where they're beginning to create an understanding of who has come out of Egypt and how they're going to move forward towards the great promised land. In the gap between the erection of the tabernacle and the numbering of the people comes this time period in which the Levitical instructions come, where they learn about how it is the priesthood is going to operate and how it's going to function. And so they process that over time. Really, though, when you begin to study the book of Numbers, you find Numbers chapter 1 through 14. That's the bulk that I won't read for you together this morning. But in Numbers chapter 1 through 14, he basically is addressing an unbelieving group. You recall that they sent out the spies that they needed to into the land. They come back and bring that evil report. They have no desire to go and really fight, even though God had already promised them the land. And all they saw were giants and resources and things that they were well below their abilities to overcome. And so they complain against that idea and decide to turn against it. And so there's this unbelieving nation because of it. In chapters 21 through 36, though, you get a different picture of the people. Because that generation wanes, right? Because God decides they're not going to go into the promised land. I'll give it to your children instead. Those folks have a greater connection to Jehovah than did their parents. You would think the folks that actually got to leave Egypt, the ones who really understood the burden and challenges that the Egyptians' enslavement had placed upon them, would have been the ones most appreciative of what God had done for them. But it didn't happen that way. And that generation decided to murmur and complain, just as Gary read as that narrative in 1 Corinthians 10 reminds us of. They began to complain and murmur about those things, and because of that, and God brought challenge to them, and it was the next generation that obviously would end up going into the promised land of God. And so with that backdrop, let's talk a little bit about that. What is it that we should learn? These things were written for an example to those whom the ends of the world have come. Those of us who live in the last dispensation need to learn something from the events and accounts of these historical narratives that are recorded for us. And one of the things that I think that we need to appreciate is the fact that not every generation shares the same passion for Jehovah that the prior or the next one will or won't. And generationally, it's kind of hard to tell sometimes whether groups will embrace God or not. That if you go throughout history, I think that you could bear pretty good evidence of the fact that there are times where people are really strong and faithful to God, and there are other generations that simply don't have any interest in Him. And I think that was true among God's people in that day, and it's still true today, where there are generations who come and go, and some, for whatever reason, decide to be more faithful than other generations have been or will be as it relates to God. Judges chapter 2 and verse 7 illustrates that for us by saying, "So the people served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders who outlived Joshua, who had seen all the great works of the Lord which He had done for Israel." Now pause for a minute. That's that history just to remind you of, right? Joshua is one of only two from that generation who was permitted to go into the promised land. And so long as they had Joshua and some elders who could remember all of those things that he could share with them, so long as they had that historical narrative and understanding of what God had done, they maintained their relationship with Him. Jump to verse 10, Judges chapter 2. When all that generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation arose after them who did not know the Lord, nor the work which He had done for Israel. One generation later, It didn't take, sometimes, and we could do this, we could illustrate to you sometimes that it looks like within Scripture there's like this 3-generational transition sometimes that happens. You'll see one generation just really faithful and the next one's kind of faithful, but they're starting to include things that's distracting them. And then by the time you get to that 3rd generational level, there's complete disinterest. Didn't even take them that long. As soon as everybody that could remember all the history were gone, the next generation decided they weren't as interested in Jehovah as the one prior. My point, friends, is simply this. I'm not trying to depress you. And I'm not trying to make us feel bad about the fact, oh boy, which generation am I? And what I'm trying to get us to see is we've got to be faithful irregardless. We have to serve the Lord irregardless. There needs to be a remnant, whether there's an entire generation who's dedicated to God or there is a small remnant of people within a generation who are faithful to God. Don't let that cyclical pattern, don't let this example of how one generation serves and the next one doesn't, or some are weaker or stronger than others, distract you and I from just simply doing what we know to be right. It's going to happen. You go through Scripture and you're going to see example after example of where there have been generations who are far more faithful than the one before it or far more faithful than the one after it. But the point simply is you and I can't be distracted by all that. For those of us who live in this last age, this last dispensation of time, we need to learn from that example and stay the course and remain dedicated and faithful. And then ask myself the question, will I encourage a generation of faithfulness or not? Will I be a catalyst to try to make the generation that I belong to more faithful than one prior? Will I be dedicated enough to encourage anyone and everyone in my generation to honor God and serve Him so that we could be described as a people dedicated unto Him? Secondly, we learned that complaining in critical moments is not helpful. They had a pattern of that, right, within the history. Problem came, let's complain. Trouble arrives, let's murmur about it. That's kind of the history that they have, and you can go out and see various texts. Let me just share 3 with you this morning, just to remind you of that history. And let's go to the very beginning of it maybe. Maybe there's some things you could point earlier than this, I suppose, but let's start here. Think about they get to the Red Sea, right? And what I see with the Red Sea is this first barrier. They leave Egypt with such hope and promise. Some have estimated, and again, it's hard to know. You kind of take we're given the numbers of the men that leave, and so you kind of extract from that, okay, there's probably wives, there's children, so people have estimated that potentially, approximately, right, speculative in some ways, about 2 million people leave Egypt and head towards the Promised Land. Now, I'd have trouble herding you all to the parking lot. And Moses has to get 2 million people led to the Promised Land. That's a challenge. Now, they have an edge, right? What's the edge? The edge is God. The edge is, this is the purposes of God. God intended for these things. God had issues for them. God had determinations for them. God had made promises to them. God was leading the way. That's the great equalizer, if you will, or the great balance in all of these things. But here they come. They're coming out of Egypt. Imagine this, just a massive amount of people. And they come to a barrier. Verse 10 of Exodus chapter 14. When Pharaoh drew near, the children of Israel lifted their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them. And so they were very afraid, and the children of Israel cried out to the Lord. Then they said to Moses, because there were no graves in Egypt, you wonder a little bit. So they cry out to the Lord. You think, is that a cry for help or is that a sign of complaint? What'd you bring us out here for? That's kind of what they say, right? They don't direct that at God necessarily. They direct that at the leader that God provided them. They direct that kind of thought to Moses. They said, weren't there enough graves back in Egypt? Had you taken us away to die in the wilderness? Why have you so dealt with us to bring us up out of Egypt? Good job, Moses. That's what they say. Great job. Thank you. We were back there in Egypt and so content and happy. Lie. Right? They'd been complaining to God for a long time about, are you going to get us out of this situation or not? Now He does, but they come to a barrier, a challenge. You've got the Egyptian army pursuing from behind and the Red Sea in front of you. Is this not the word that we told you in Egypt? Verse 12, they said. Let us alone that we may serve the Egyptians. For it would have been better for us to serve the Egyptians than that we should die in the wilderness. You've heard me say this before, and I'll repeat it again. Sometimes all we see is the obstacles. And we don't see the power of our God. Sometimes all we see is the challenge. All we see is the Red Sea in front of me, and I think, how in the world am I going to get across this? How am I going to get from here to there? Because I can't go backwards. Because I've got an enemy pursuing me on that side, and I've got this tremendous barrier in front of me. What am I going to do in this moment? And that moment isn't a time for murmur and complain. That's a moment of trust. That's the example we should be learning from. That's a moment where we encourage one another to be faithful and to be trusting. God can find paths that we can't see. God can find means and ways that you and I could not conjure and create on our own. God will strengthen and help and provide answer to the challenges, especially when we're speaking about the spiritual difficulties that we may be experiencing. I'm not challenging you or suggesting at all that you tempt God by walking down here to the Ohio River and say, Lord, part it so that I can go to fly. I'm saying we need to be careful. Not to tempt God and to say, you owe me this or you should do this for me. But trust Him that when challenges and difficulties do arrive, He does provide answer. He does provide hope. Jump a couple chapters to chapter 16. They come into that wilderness. They journeyed from Elim, and all the congregation of the children of Israel came to the wilderness of Sin, which is between Elim and Samar. And on the 15th day, or Sinai rather, on the 15th day of the second month after they departed from the land of Egypt. Then the whole congregation of the children of Israel complained against Moses and Aaron in the wilderness. Stop for a moment. Remember, that's not 15 guys. That's a congregation of an estimated 2 million people. And you can just imagine that buzz of complaint as it begins to those who are closer to Moses in proximity, and it begins this wave of complaint. You can just kind of hear that noise. And it just gets louder and louder as more and more people within the congregation and company begin to complain and murmur about the situation they're in. The children said to them, oh, that we had, here we go again, oh, that we had died by the hand of the Lord in the land of Egypt, but when we sat by the pots of meat, and when we had bread to the full, for you have brought us out into this wilderness to kill this whole assembly with hunger. Boy, they have strange memories, don't they? When they wanted out of Egypt, it was a horrible, deplorable situation and place that God needed to get them out of. Now, all of a sudden, it just sounds like a wonderful place where their plates were always full and the comforts were afforded to them at every turn. It's amazing sometimes when we convince ourselves in that vernacular that we use that the grass is somehow greener. What's interesting is they've convinced themselves the grass is greener back in Egypt than it is in the place that flows with milk and honey. They just have to get there. Do not be tempted to believe the world is better than heaven. Don't be tempted to be convinced that somehow we'd have been better off if God had just left us alone and not challenged us to follow His ways and follow His path to get to the hope and promises that He affords us. One more example, chapter 17, verse 1. Then all the congregation of the children of Israel set out on their journey from the wilderness of Sin according to the commandment of the Lord and camped in Rephidim. But there was no water for the people to drink. And therefore the people contended with Moses and said, give us water that we may drink. So Moses said to them, why do you contend with me? Why do you tempt the Lord? Remember what we said earlier? about this idea of make sure we're cautious not to make and place demands upon God, and almost challenged him as if he will or won't honor what he's promised. Why are you tempting God? The people thirsted there for water, and the people complained against Moses and said, why is it you have brought us out of Egypt to kill us and our children and our livestock with thirst? Weren't there enough graves when they were at the Red Sea? Wasn't there plenty to eat back in Egypt when the food was not there? And now we're going to die of thirst. Friends, we need to learn that complaining in critical moments will not help. Complaining to Moses about being thirsty wasn't going to provide for them water. Complaining to Moses about being hungry wasn't going to fill their bellies. Complaining to Moses about the barrier of the Red Sea and a pursuing Egyptian army wasn't going to resolve that situation. The only way to resolve any of that was to turn to the one who brought them out of Egypt to begin with. And friends, when we come out of sin and we come out of the world and we come out of the challenges that the world brings and the difficulties that it creates for us in our lives, don't become disappointed or disillusioned in some way. To think that God will not provide for us the spiritual things necessary to carry us over those barriers and challenges and temptations that come. We live in a dispensation that has all the education necessary to know the power of God. We live in a dispensation that has the education to know how when people trust Him, it works out for their good. They become more than conquerors. And we need to learn from those who walked before us. You go back into that Numbers account. There's something else that they needed to learn and that we need to learn from them. The Red Sea wasn't a challenge. Water and food from a God who would provide for them wasn't a challenge. The giants in the land, the sons of Anak that dwelled in the promised land were not the challenge. The challenge was, would they see real difficulties and know God could answer them, or would they create new ones for themselves? Remember, all the while they kept saying, well, this is about the children. It's about the children. You've brought us out here, and our children, our livestock, and everything that we brought out of Egypt is going to be destroyed out here in the wilderness or in this situation. And verse 31 of Numbers 14, God says, but your little ones whom you said would be victims, I will bring in, and they shall know the land which you have despised. You thought you were protecting them when I'm the only one that could have protected you and them all along, God says. You felt like if you had just gone back to Egypt, your children would be better off. And the truth is that wasn't the case. They would be better off if the parents would stay faithful and dedicated and trust in Jehovah. Let me go back to that generational conversation for a moment. I don't know what's going to come within generations. You can't predict it. You might wonder how, you go back and look at some of the kings, and you see them and you go, why did that guy become so bad? And then you look at one of the good ones and go, that was amazing. That with his background, he still come out of that and wanted to serve and honor God. You can't pick and choose sometimes some kind of methodology to know what generation will be faithful or not. My point, friends, is simply this. We can't become so discouraged and challenged and overthink that so much that we begin to make choices and decisions that are a detriment to the next generation in their faithfulness. They thought they were helping their little ones by wanting to go back to Egypt when all they really needed to do was trust God. He got you out of Egypt. He just showed you 10 plagues. If your living firstborn is standing there with you because you were wise enough to get inside the house with the blood on the doorposts, you shouldn't have needed anything else to tell you that God could get you through this. You know, sometimes we forget that aspect about their journey out of Egypt. It's just like the miracles of Jesus. John said, these are written, John 20, verse 30 and 31, but these are written that ye may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of the living God. Jesus did many things, and these are recorded so we can genuinely believe in Him as Jesus. Well, they had miracles too. They witnessed 10 plagues come and go out of Egypt that finally convinced Pharaoh enough, I need to let these people go do what they're supposed to do for their God, and then they forgot. Don't forget. And don't ever convince yourself that somehow you or I are doing the next generation some kind of benefit if we abandon God in the process. Or if we murmur and complain against Him in the process. We are of no value to them when we let that mindset rule. And when we let the world dictate and control our thinking. And I don't want to trivialize that because I know it's not always easy. It is hard to live in the world and not be of the world. It's hard. To exist within the framework of the confines of this life with its temptations and challenges and difficulties, it is difficult to live in the world but not be of the world, and yet that's the challenge that every faithful believer needs to absorb. Verse 15 of 1 John 2, do not love the world. That's how we do it, by the way. You can't love it. Don't love the world. Do not love the world or the things in the world. And if anyone loves the world, the love of the Father is not in him. For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but is of the world. And the world is passing away in the lust of it, but he who does the will of God abides forever. I believe in this narrative, he's using that idea of love the world in the same way that Jesus did when he spoke about you can't serve two masters, for you will either love the one and hate the other, you will regard the one and despise the other. That's the same imagery here. You cannot place emphasis on the world and still feel like I can stay connected to God in the same breath. You cannot live in and of, I should say, the world. I cannot live in the passions and the desires and the temptations and the lust that he labels here in this text. If that's where my love is, then that's where my heart will be, and that's where my conduct will follow. I will disregard God. And friend, let's be open and honest real quick here. Every time and notice I use the word I, not you. Every time I sin, I'm disregarding God. Every time I choose sin, I'm disregarding God. I'm saying, I'm putting Him as a lesser priority, and whatever it is that I was tempted with became the priority. Now, I say that not to excuse it or to permit it, or but to just simply be honest about that. I would hope that if I want to live as a child of God, I want to be a believer, I want to be a disciple, I want to love the Lord, then maybe each time that temptation to commit sin will come, if I'll remind myself, if I choose that, I am disregarding the God I claim to love. And maybe that'll just be that last kind of conscience effective method to keep me from choosing sin. So let's learn to be cautious about who and what is influencing us. Let's be careful, because I don't want to disregard God. I don't want to choose sin over Him, and I don't want to be guilty of all these things. In Exodus chapter 12, 38, and in Numbers 11 and verse 4, we learn that when they came out of Egypt, there was some, the Bible calls them rabble, but they were basically non-Israelites who attached themselves to this enclave of 2 million people leaving Egypt. There were, keep in mind, it'd be kind of hard, right? Again, if this was 5 or 10 people leaving Egypt, and you're going, who's number 11? Where'd that guy come from? You'd know him, right? You'd be able to identify. But you got 2 million people leaving Egypt. It's hard to know. You've got folks that just kind of attach themselves to the trip, and they're just kind of there, and they become known as the rabble. But the problem is, they don't have any connectivity to God, not Jehovah God. And so they begin to cause trouble and difficulties. Let me share a text with you. The Galatian writer writes in Galatians chapter 2. Galatians chapter 2 and verse 5. When Paul spoke of those in New Testament times who were trying to persuade the people away from God, notice that he said, to whom we did not yield submission even for an hour, that the truth of the gospel might continue with you. Paul said there comes a point where you've got to, we have to be so cautious that you begin to even entertain certain thoughts and certain ideas that are just blatantly and obviously contrary to the will of God. Great difficulties. They listened to the rabble, and it created difficulties for them. And sometimes we listen to all the wrong influences and all the wrong voices and thoughts that people are sharing with us. Be careful. Be careful who you seek advice from. There's no reason for the Israelites to be talking to the rabble at all. There was no reason for them to be going to them and say, hey, what do you guys think about this? They were the people of God. And I'm not trying to be judgmental. I'm just trying to say they were the ones with the connectivity to God. They were the bloodline of heritage of God. They need to be consulting God and His leaders. They were talking to the rabble. What are we going to do about this? When you're spiritually challenged, find spiritually minded people to talk about that with. Right? When you or I are facing some kind of spiritual hardship or difficulty, and we're seeking answers, and we're trying to reestablish our hope and commitment and convictions in God, then find spiritually minded people to help me with that. If my desire is to be spiritual, that's what I'll do. If my desire is to be worldly, I'll choose worldly counsel. And you tell me whether or not that's true. Because we've all probably been guilty of it at some point or another. We wanted to do something worldly, so we found a worldly influence to go talk about that, and they agreed with us, and we felt good about it because somebody agreed, and we walked that path. But if my genuine desire is be the disciple of God, be the follower of Jesus, then why not seek the spiritual counsel from somebody who could help or encourage me to be faithful rather than choose the world? Food for thought. And I readily admit to you, there have been times in my life where I've done that very thing. Where I wanted to do something, so I'll listen to somebody who's going to agree with me and lead me there. Then there were times where I'm trying to correct my faith and trying to challenge my faith to be stronger, and I found people who could lead me there too. And you and I have to decide which will be better. Because we have a greater responsibility than those in some ways in that day, because we have all the history, all the knowledge. And that text in 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 6 illustrates that very same basic point, that we have these examples, we have these examples before us. We have all that we need to know how to choose wisely. Will we? Will we? There is certainly a fountain of salvation offered unto any and all who would come to Him. An opportunity to know the Lord and to serve Him with all our heart and soul and mind. We have this great gospel message that leads us to salvation, freely offered to any and all who would come to it. So I ask you this morning, what will we choose? Now that we live in this great age, this dispensation with all the benefit of all that knowledge and history and examples that we can learn from, we don't have to experience everything. We can read and educate ourselves about how God interacted with folks who made certain kinds of choices. I bear the greater responsibility. I gain the greater blessings because of the age that I live in, but I also gain the greater responsibility because of the age I live in. So what will I do with Jesus today? Will I honor Him? Will I choose and make decisions and make connectivity that will lead me to greater spirituality, or will I disregard God? Those are choices all of us individually have to make. But loving the Lord with all your heart and all your soul and all your mind, to choose Him brings the greater reward and greater benefit that God wants all to experience. I said this Friday night as I wrapped up the gospel meeting up in Austin town. I said, at the end of the day, don't we just want to go to heaven? Isn't that kind of it? And we're flawed and we're challenged and we need to make corrections and we need to have greater faith at times. All those things that we can encourage. But at the end of the day, just want to go to heaven. I want everybody there. I want everybody to be there as well. And let's all just do what God is encouraging us and commanding us to do to arrive there someday. And if we could help you start that journey or return to it today, won't